Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that deserves both your full attention and your deepest respect. We're stepping into the kitchens, the cabins, the gardens, and the churchyards, where one of America's most powerful culinary traditions was born. Not in a restaurant, not in a cookbook, but in the hands of people who were told they were worth less than the crops they harvested, and who responded by creating a cuisine so rich, so resourceful, and so deeply human that it would outlast every system designed to crush them. Tonight, we're talking about how soul food traditions were built in the South. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Tell me your favorite soul food dish, the one that takes you straight back to somebody's kitchen, and whether you learned to cook it from a recipe or from standing beside someone who never measured a single thing. I read every comment, mostly because I can't sleep either. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Get yourself settled in, maybe grab a snack, though I'll warn you, by the time we're done tonight, you're going to be craving cornbread, greens, and something simmered low and slow for longer than you've been awake. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's get curious for a second. Have you ever wondered where soul food actually came from? Not the restaurant version, not the holiday version, but the original. What did enslaved people actually eat when their entire weekly ration was a peck of cornmeal and a few pounds of pork? How do you feed a family when everything you're given is the scraps that nobody else wanted? What happens when you bring centuries of West African culinary knowledge to a place that treats you like property? Can a pot of greens simmered with a ham hock carry the memory of an entire continent? How did fried chicken become Sunday's sacred bird? And why does your grandmother's kitchen still smell like a love letter written in cast iron and slow heat? Congratulations. You've just woken up in the year 1845, somewhere in the deep south of Mississippi. The air is thick and warm, carrying the faint sweetness of magnolia and something heavier underneath. The mineral tang of red clay and the smoke of a fire that's been burning since before dawn. You're in the quarters, the small cluster of cabins behind the main house, and the first thing you notice isn't what you see, it's what you smell. Cornbread baking in a cast iron skillet over an open hearth. The slow, savory perfume of pork fat rendering into greens, and underneath it all, the earthy sweetness of sweet potatoes buried in the ashes at the edge of the fire. Welcome to the birthplace of soul food. Not a gleaming kitchen, not a well-stocked pantry, a one-room cabin with a dirt floor, a single fireplace, and more ingenuity per square foot than most Michelin-starred restaurants will ever know. Here's the thing about soul food that the stories don't emphasize enough. It didn't begin as a celebration. It began as a problem. A daily, grinding, life or death problem. How do you keep yourself alive, keep your family fed, keep your children strong enough to survive, when the people who control every hour of your day have decided that your nutrition is an expense to be minimized? That's the question at the heart of everything we're going to talk about tonight. And the answer, built over generations by millions of hands that history rarely bothered to name, became one of the most extraordinary culinary traditions on earth. Let's start where all food starts, with the ingredients. And in your case, there aren't many of them. Every Sunday morning, you line up at the corn crib and the smokehouse. This is the weekly ritual of ration day. And if you're thinking it sounds like a trip to the grocery store, adjust your expectations dramatically. What you receive is this: enough corn to make roughly a peck of cornmeal. That's about 8 dry quarts. and somewhere between 3 and 4 pounds of pork. Not the pork you're imagining, not chops or roasts or tenderloins. Those go to the main house. What comes to you is what's left after the planter's family has taken everything they want. The feet, the ears, the jowls, the tail, the intestines, the skin, the neck bones, the parts that the people up at the big house consider waste, garbage, not worth the effort of preparation. And that's it. That's your week. Cornmeal and cast-off pork, no sugar, or so little it might as well be a rumour. No coffee, no tea. Maybe some salt if you're fortunate, though even that isn't guaranteed. Solomon Northup, a free black man kidnapped into slavery in Louisiana, described the ration system in terms that make a modern grocery list look like a feast. He noted that what enslaved people received was corn and bacon, period. No tea, no coffee, no sugar, and only the most meagre sprinkling of salt. Now here's where the story most people tell about soul food usually stops. They describe the scraps, they describe the deprivation, and they leave it there, as if the entire tradition were nothing more than a monument to suffering. But that's not even close to the full picture, because what happened next, what happened with those scraps, is where the genius begins. You take that peck of cornmeal back to your cabin, and you don't see limitation. You see possibility. That corn becomes cornbread, baked in a cast iron skillet, greased with whatever fat you've saved. It becomes hoe cakes, thin and crispy, cooked on the flat blade of a hoe held over the fire when no skillet is available. It becomes corn pone, dense and filling, shaped by hand and baked in the ashes. It becomes dumplings dropped into boiling water with whatever greens or beans you've managed to find. One ingredient, dozens of preparations, each one adapted to what's available, what's needed, and how much time you have before the horn calls you back to the field. And that pork, those unwanted, discarded, supposedly worthless parts. You clean the intestines yourself, a process so labor-intensive and so unpleasant that it would drive most modern cooks straight out of the kitchen. You soak them, you scrape them, you wash them again and again in cold water until they're clean enough to cook. And then you simmer them slowly, for hours, until they transform into chitterlings, tender and rich and savory. The feet get boiled until the collagen breaks down into a silky, gelatinous broth that makes everything it touches more nourishing. The jowls and the neck bones become flavoring agents, simmered into pots of beans or greens, turning simple vegetables into something deeply satisfying. The skin gets fried until it crackles, a snack and a seasoning in one. The fat gets rendered into lard, which becomes your cooking, oil, your butter substitute, and your primary source of concentrated calories. Here's the thing. None of this was random. None of it was accidental. What looks from the outside like making do was actually the application of sophisticated culinary knowledge that stretched back centuries and crossed an ocean. The people in these cabins carried in their memories, in their hands, in their very understanding of how food works, traditions from West and Central Africa that were as old as civilization itself. Let's talk about that for a moment, because this is the part of the story that gets erased more than any other. Soul food didn't begin on a plantation. It began in Africa. The women and men who were stolen from West Africa and brought to the American South in chains were not arriving culturally blank. They were bringing with them generations of agricultural expertise, culinary technique, and food knowledge that would reshape the entire American South. They knew how to cultivate rice, and they knew it so well that enslaved Africans from rice-growing regions like Senegambia and Sierra Leone were specifically sought by South Carolina planters because of their expertise. That's not a footnote. That's an entire colonial agricultural economy built on stolen knowledge from stolen people. The rice that became a cornerstone of Southern cooking didn't just show up. It was planted, cultivated, and harvested by people who had been growing it for centuries before they ever saw American soil. They brought okra, carried in the holds of slave ships, or perhaps in the memories of people who knew exactly what to plant when they reached foreign soil. Okra, that humble green pod, became the foundation of gumbo, a dish that would come to define Louisiana cooking. They brought black-eyed peas, which became Hoppin' John, and 100 other preparations. They brought sorghum, which became the syrup that sweetened cornbread and biscuits across the South. They brought watermelon, cultivated from a native African vine. They brought sesame seeds, known in many African languages as beni, which showed up in cookies and candies and as a finishing garnish on everything from bread to vegetables. And they brought techniques. The one-pot stew, a foundation of West African cooking, became the basis for gumbo, for stews, for the big communal pots that simmered over cabin fires. The practice of cooking greens, essential across dozens of African culinary traditions, became the collard greens, mustard greens, and turnip greens that define soul food to this day. The tradition of using bold, pungent seasonings to stretch and transform modest ingredients became the backbone of Southern flavor. Hot peppers, vinegar-based sauces, layers of smoke and salt and heat. These weren't Southern inventions. They were African traditions adapted to American ingredients. Even the cooking over open fire, the slow roasting of meats over wood coals, the basting with vinegar and pepper sauces, these, practices that would eventually become American barbecue, have roots that reach straight back to West and Central Africa. Historians have documented that enslaved Africans in the colonial period were observed making sauces from crushed peppers mixed with salt and preserved in bottles, creating condiments that bear a clear resemblance to the barbecue sauces that are now synonymous with the American South. So when you're standing in that cabin in 1845, looking at your meager rations and your cast iron pot and your open fire, you're not starting from nothing. You're drawing on a deep well of ancestral knowledge that crossed the Atlantic in the minds and hands of people who were never supposed to retain their culture, their identity, or their humanity. The fact that they did, the fact that the food tradition survived, adapted, and thrived is one of the most remarkable acts of cultural preservation in human history. But the rations alone aren't enough. They were never enough. The planter of meal and those few pounds of pork might have been enough to keep the people going for a while, but it was not enough to keep them healthy. That peck of meal and those few pounds of pork might keep you alive. They would not keep you strong. They would not keep your children healthy. They would not sustain the back-breaking labor demanded of you from before dawn until after dark. So you supplemented, you improvised, you found food wherever food could be found. And this is where the story gets beautiful. After the day's work is done, after the horn has released you from the fields or the sugar house or the tobacco barn, after you've dragged yourself back to the quarters with muscles screaming and feet aching, the second shift begins. You tend your garden. Almost every plantation allowed enslaved people small plots of land, usually surrounding their cabins, where they could grow their own food. The planters allowed this not out of generosity, but out of economics. Every vegetable you grew for yourself was one less thing the planter had to provide. But for you, that garden was something else entirely. It was autonomy. It was a tiny sliver of control in a life defined by the absence of control. And it was sustenance, in every sense of the word. You worked these gardens in the margins of your day. before dawn, after sunset, by moonlight and torchlight when no other time was available. On Sundays, the one day most plantations granted some rest, you could garden in actual daylight. Colonial Williamsburg historians have documented that enslaved people on Virginia plantations literally gardened by moonlight, using torches to see what they were planting and harvesting, because every other hour of daylight belonged to someone else. And what you grew was extraordinary. Sweet potatoes, which became one of the most important foods in the enslaved diet. They stored well, cooked easily, tasted good, and provided essential nutrients that cornmeal and salt pork couldn't deliver. You grew cowpeas, the ancestor of the black-eyed pea, brought from Africa and perfectly adapted to southern soil and climate. You grew collard greens, cabbages, turnips, and whatever other vegetables the soil and season would support. You grew watermelon. You grew herbs, not just for cooking, but for medicine, because the enslaved community had its own healers and its own pharmacopoeia, and the garden was the pharmacy. Some people kept chickens. Some raised a pig of their own when allowed. And beyond the garden, there was the wild. You fished the rivers and creeks. You set traps for rabbits, opossums, raccoons, and squirrels. You hunted when you could. Archaeological evidence from plantation sites across Virginia has turned up bones from deer, opossum, turkey, and dozens of species of fish, all found in the living quarters of enslaved people. Some of these animals are nocturnal, which tells its own story. People were hunting at night, after a full day of forced labor, because feeding their families mattered that much. You foraged too. Wild berries, persimmons, nuts, herbs that grew along fence lines and at the edges of forests. Every calorie counted. Every vitamin mattered. And the knowledge of what was edible, what was medicinal, what was poisonous. This was community knowledge, passed down through generations and shared among neighbors in the quarters. Here's the thing about all of this that strikes me every time. The standard narrative of slavery focuses, understandably, on the horror, on the violence, the dehumanization, the systematic cruelty. And all of that is true and important and must never be minimized. But when you look at the food story, when you look at what people built in those gardens and those kitchens, you see something the standard narrative often misses. You see agency. You see people who were legally classified as property refusing to eat like property, refusing to accept that their only sustenance would be whatever scraps their enslaver saw fit to distribute. They took control of their own nutrition in whatever ways they could. They fed themselves. They fed their families. They fed their neighbors. And in doing so, they created a culinary tradition that would outlast the institution that tried to starve them. Let's step inside the cabin kitchen, if you can even call it that. There's no separate room for cooking. There's a fireplace, maybe 4 feet wide, and everything happens there. Your primary tool is a cast iron pot, heavy enough to require 2 hands, blackened with years of use, and shared among several families if you're unlucky enough not to have your own. There might be a cast iron skillet. There might be a Dutch oven, a flat-bottomed pot with a heavy lid designed to sit directly in the coals, with more coals heaped on top, creating a primitive but remarkably effective oven. The fire is everything. It's your stove, your oven, your heater, and your light source. Managing it is a skill that takes years to develop, knowing how to bank the coals for slow cooking, how to build the heat for frying, how to create a bed of embers just right for baking cornbread. The women who worked these fires, and it was predominantly women who handled the cooking in the quarters, were performing feats of culinary engineering with equipment that would make a modern chef weep. Dinner in the quarters is not a leisurely affair. It's prepared late at night, after the second shift of gardening and chores. Solomon Northup described the evening routine with a kind of exhausted precision. You reach the quarters, sleepy and overcome with the long day's toil. Then a fire must be kindled in the cabin, the corn ground in the small hand mill, and supper and dinner for the next day in the field prepared. That hand mill, by the way, is a simple stone grinder. You pour in dried corn and crank the handle, and out comes meal, coarse and gritty, and flecked with bits of hull. It takes time, it takes effort, and you're doing it after a day of labor that would hospitalize most people reading this. But here's where the alchemy happens. You take that fresh ground cornmeal and you mix it with water and a little of the rendered pork fat. Maybe you add some salt if you have it. You shape it into a pone, a thick flat cake, and you nestle it into the hot ashes at the edge of the fire. Or you press it thin and cook it on a grease skillet, and it crisps up into a hoe cake with edges that shatter when you bite them. If you've been lucky enough to find eggs, if your neighbor's chicken cooperated this week, you might make it richer, almost cake-like. Meanwhile, the greens are cooking. You pick them earlier, from your garden, or from the edges of the fields. Collards, turnip greens, mustard greens, whatever the season provides. You've washed them carefully, stripped the tough stems, and torn the leaves into pieces. They go into the pot with water and whatever pork you're using for flavor. A ham hock, a piece of fatback, neck, bones if you're fortunate. The greens cook slowly, the liquid drawing out the minerals and vitamins from the leaves, the pork fat providing richness and depth. That liquid, the broth that remains after the greens are cooked, would later become known as pot liquor, and it's arguably one of the most nutritious things in the entire meal. People drank it straight, sopped it up with cornbread, or used it as the base for the next day's cooking. Nothing was wasted. Nothing could afford to be wasted. If you've managed to catch a fish or trap a rabbit, that changes the whole complexion of the evening. Fresh protein is a luxury. A catfish pulled from the creek gets gutted, rolled in cornmeal, and fried in hot lard. The cornmeal crust crackles and turns golden brown, and for a few minutes, standing there in the firelight with a piece of hot fried catfish in your hands, life contains a small, fierce pleasure that no amount of oppression can entirely extinguish. And this is where soul food's emotional core lives, not just in the ingredients, not just in the techniques, but in what the food meant to the people who made it. Cooking in the quarters was an act of love performed under impossible conditions. It was a mother grinding corn at 10 o'clock at night, so her children wouldn't go hungry the next day. It was a community sharing a pot of greens because one family's garden failed and another's came in strong. It was the preservation of African traditions, the passing down of knowledge from mother to daughter, from elder to child, in a system that tried to sever every family tie and destroy every cultural connection. The cabin kitchen was also a classroom. This is where children learned, not from books, which were forbidden, but from watching, helping, and doing. A girl learned how to judge the heat of a fire by holding her hand near the coals and counting. She learned how to tell when cornbread was done by the sound it made when you tapped it. She learned which wild greens were safe to eat and which ones would make you sick. She learned the rhythms of the seasons, what to plant and when to harvest, how to put up preserves in whatever containers were available, how to stretch a little into a lot. This was an education as rigorous and as valuable as anything taught in any school, and it was transmitted entirely through oral tradition because the people who held this knowledge were legally forbidden from writing it down. Let's talk about the other kitchen now. because while the quarters had their own cooking traditions, there was another culinary world operating on every plantation, and it was run by enslaved hands as well. The big house kitchen. If you were an enslaved cook assigned to the planter's family, your life was a particular kind of contradiction. You were responsible for producing meals that would impress guests, satisfy demanding palates, and uphold the social reputation of people who legally owned you. You baked bread and roasted meats, and made jellies and crafted elaborate desserts for tables you would never sit at. You cooked breakfast, dinner, and supper, and if a traveler showed up at 2 in the morning expecting hospitality, a bell would ring and you'd be expected to produce biscuits, ham, and brandy, as if you'd been waiting for precisely this moment. Enslaved cooks in the big house were some of the most skilled food professionals in America, and they were never paid a cent for their expertise. They learned European cooking techniques because the planter class demanded them, but they didn't abandon their own traditions. They blended, they fused. They took the roasting and baking methods favored by English and Scottish settlers, the deep frying techniques that historians trace partly to Scottish immigrants, the pastry-making traditions of the Dutch, and they layered their own African sensibilities on top of all of it. The result was something new, something that didn't exist in Europe or in Africa, but belonged entirely to this place, this moment, this brutal and creative collision of cultures. Think about fried chicken for a second. It's arguably the most iconic soul food dish in existence, and its origin story is a map of exactly this cultural fusion. West Africans had traditions of frying food, often in palm oil. Scottish settlers brought their own frying traditions to the American South. Enslaved cooks took both influences, applied them to the chickens they raised and the lard they rendered, and created something that transcended its sources. Fried chicken, crispy and golden and seasoned with the bold flavors that African cooking traditions demanded, became the crown jewel of Southern food, and for a long time it became specifically associated with black cooks and black cooking, because they were the ones who perfected it. The same story plays out dish after dish. Macaroni and cheese, now a soul food staple, evolved from an earlier preparation sometimes called macaroni pie, adapted and enriched by black cooks who made it richer, creamier, and more deeply seasoned than any European version. Sweet potato pie came from the intersection of West African yam traditions and Dutch pastry making, filtered through the creativity of enslaved bakers who substituted the sweet potatoes available in the American South for the yams they remembered from Africa. Cornbread was born from Native American corn cultivation, processed through African cooking methods, and shaped into the dozens of regional variations that exist to this day. Here's the catch, and it's a catch that echoes through the entire history of American food. The enslaved cooks who created these dishes, who developed these techniques, who fed both the planter's table and the quarter's table, rarely received credit for any of it. White plantation mistresses published cookbooks featuring recipes they'd learned from their black cooks, often using stereotypical images of black women on the covers to market the very knowledge they'd appropriated. The food that enslaved people created became Southern cuisine, a regional identity that quietly erased the people who'd actually done the cooking. The kitchen was one of the most powerful places on a plantation, and the people who ran it were among the most skilled workers on the property, and yet their names, their innovations, their contributions were swallowed by a system that refused to acknowledge their humanity, let alone their artistry. But let's return to the quarters, because that's where the heart of what we now call soul food was beating strongest. Sunday was the day, the one day most plantations allowed some rest, and it was on Sundays that the cooking traditions of the enslaved community found their fullest expression. if the daily cooking was about survival, about getting enough calories into your body to endure another day of forced labor, Sunday cooking was about something more. It was about community, about pleasure, about asserting that you were a human being with a human need for food that tasted good, food that was shared around a table or a fire pit with people you loved. On Sundays, if you'd been fortunate enough to raise a chicken, you might slaughter it, clean it, cut it up, season it with whatever peppers and salt you could get your hands on, and fry it in a skillet of hot lard. That fried chicken, the gospel bird, as it would later be called, became the centerpiece of the weekly ritual. It wasn't everyday food. Meat of any kind was too precious and too scarce for that. Fried chicken was special. It was celebratory. It marked the one day in 7 when your time was partially your own, and your cooking could be something more than mere fuel. The Sunday meal was also where the one-pot tradition of West Africa showed itself most clearly. A big iron pot hung over the fire, and into it went whatever the week had provided. Greens from the garden, beans or peas dried and stored from earlier harvests, pork bones for flavor, sweet potatoes if you had them. The pot simmered for hours, the flavors merging and deepening, the tough greens breaking down into silky tenderness, the broth becoming dark and rich with the extracted essence of everything inside it. This was communal cooking at its most fundamental. One pot, many ingredients, a meal that could stretch to feed however many people needed feeding. And this is where we need to talk about the role of community in soul food, because it's impossible to understand this cuisine without understanding the social fabric it was woven into. The quarters were not just a collection of individual cabins. They were a community under siege, yes. A community whose bonds were constantly threatened by the sale of family members, by the arbitrary cruelty of overseers, by the exhaustion of forced labor. But a community nonetheless. And food was one of the primary ways that community sustained itself. Women cooked for each other's children. If a mother was kept late in the fields or assigned to the big house, her neighbor fed her kids. When someone managed to catch a deer or land a particularly good haul of fish, the bounty was shared. When a family's garden failed, others gave from their own. The sharing of food was an act of mutual aid, a system of informal welfare more sophisticated and more effective than anything the planter class could have imagined. Primarily because the planter class couldn't imagine enslaved people having the capacity for social organization. Feasts happened too, not often, but when they did, they were events that the entire community remembered. Some planters hosted annual barbecues for their enslaved workers, partly as a control mechanism, a way to let off steam and create the illusion of generosity, but partly because they knew that the enslaved community's cooking was superb. The irony was not lost on anyone. Enslaved cooks were acknowledged even by their enslavers as the best barbecue masters in the South. When the big house hosted a barbecue for white guests, it was enslaved hands that dug the pit, tended the fire, slow roasted the meat, and prepared the sauces. The reputation of the planter as a gracious host rested entirely on the skill of the people he held in bondage. But the community's own feasts, the ones held in the quarters on holidays or special occasions, those were different. Lewis Hughes, an enslaved man who later wrote about his experiences in Mississippi, described the feast preparations with a kind of vivid joy that cuts through the usual language of hardship. He described large fires built under trees, kettles hung over the flames, cabbage and meat boiling, and the preparation of peach cobbler baked in Dutch ovens with layers of crust and fresh peaches and sugar. He described the tables set in a grove near the quarters, the tin plates and cups, The buttermilk and water served as drinks. It was not fine dining, but it was, in every way that matters, a meal shared in community and prepared with skill and love. These feasts were where cooking knowledge was displayed and transmitted. The older women who supervised the cooking were respected figures in the community, and their knowledge of how to stretch ingredients, how to season, how to time the cooking so that everything came together at once. This was expertise that commanded admiration. Younger women watched and learned. The recipes, such as they were, existed only in memory and in practice. They would not be written down until after emancipation, when the first black-authored cookbooks began to appear. Abby Fisher's What Mrs. Fisher Knows About Old Southern Cooking, published in 1881, is generally considered the first, and it represents just the tiniest fraction of the culinary knowledge that had been passed down through generations of enslaved cooks. Let's talk about specific dishes now, because the devil is in the details, and the details are where the genius lives. Greens, collard, greens specifically, though mustard greens, turnip greens and kale all played their parts. The practice of boiling leafy greens is ancient and universal, but the way it was done in the enslaved quarters had distinctly African fingerprints. In West Africa, dishes like gomenwot in Ethiopia and kontomire stew in Ghana use similar techniques, slow cooking greens with aromatics and fats until they became tender and deeply flavored. In the American South, enslaved cooks adapted these methods to local ingredients. Collard greens, which grew abundantly and tolerated the southern climate, became the green of choice. They were cooked slowly for hours, with pork for flavoring. The long cooking time broke down the tough leaves and allowed the fat and seasonings to penetrate fully. The resulting dish was earthy, savory, slightly bitter, and profoundly satisfying. And that pot liquor, let's give it the respect it deserves. The liquid left in the pot after the greens were cooked was loaded with vitamins and minerals leached from the leaves during cooking. In a diet chronically short on nutrients, pot liquor was essentially a vitamin supplement, delivered in a form that tasted good and could be consumed with cornbread. People who drank their pot liquor were practicing a form of nutritional science that wouldn't be formally understood for another century. Sweet potatoes. These became the Swiss Army knife of the enslaved kitchen. You could bake them in the ashes. You could boil them and mash them. You could slice them and fry them. You could candy them with whatever sweetener you had on hand, be it molasses, sorghum syrup, or, on rare occasions, actual sugar. You could dry them for storage. You could make them into pies. The sweet potato was versatile, calorie-dense, nutritious, and relatively easy to grow. It became a staple not by choice, but by necessity, and in the process, it became beloved. The sweet potato also represents one of the most fascinating acts of culinary memory in this entire tradition. In West Africa, yams were a dietary cornerstone. True yams, a different plant entirely from the sweet potato, but similar enough in some respects that enslaved Africans recognized the sweet potato as a plausible substitute. They began calling sweet potatoes yams, a linguistic substitution that persists to this day across the American South. When you hear someone call a sweet potato a yam, you're hearing an echo of Africa, a word carried across the ocean by people who refused to let their language, their food categories, their way of understanding the world be completely erased. Black-eyed peas are another direct line back to Africa. Cowpeas, as they're technically known, were cultivated across West Africa for centuries before they arrived in the Americas. They came with the slave trade, part of the provisions loaded onto ships for the voyage, and they took root in southern soil as if they'd always belonged there. Black-eyed peas became Hoppin' John when cooked with rice and pork. They became a centerpiece of New Year's traditions in the Black South, eaten for good luck on the first day of the year. Food historians have drawn direct parallels between Hoppin' John and dishes like waki from Ghana and tibu nebe from Senegal. Different continents, different centuries, same tradition. Okra deserves its own chapter, and tonight we'll give it a good long section at least. This remarkable plant, likely originating in Ethiopia and widely cultivated across West Africa, arrived in the Americas through the slave trade and immediately began transforming southern cooking. Okra's signature characteristic, the thick, mucilaginous quality that some people love and others find challenging, made it an extraordinary thickening agent for soups and stews. In Louisiana, it became the foundation of gumbo, a word that itself derives from the Bantu word for okra. Gumbo is, in many ways, a perfect metaphor for soul food itself. African, European, and Native American ingredients and techniques converging in a single pot, stirred and simmered, until they become something none of those traditions could have produced alone. But okra's versatility went far beyond gumbo. It was fried, it was pickled, it was stewed with tomatoes. It was used as a coffee substitute when roasted and ground. It was even used to make rope from its fibrous stalks. If there's a single plant that embodies the African contribution to American food culture, it might be okra, quietly ubiquitous, endlessly adaptable, and carrying its African origins in every seed pod. Rice tells another powerful story. The most common forms of rice grown in the Americas today were introduced through the slave trade, and the expertise required to cultivate them came from West African rice-growing regions. Enslaved Africans from Senegambia and Sierra Leone were specifically targeted by South Carolina planters because they already knew how to grow rice in tidal conditions. This wasn't unskilled labor. This was the deliberate exploitation of sophisticated agricultural knowledge. The rice plantations of the Carolina Low Country were built on African expertise, and the rice dishes that emerged from those regions, jambalaya, red beans and rice, Hoppin' John, Low Country Pelou, carry the DNA of West African rice culture in every grain. The parallels between southern rice dishes and West African rice traditions are too specific to be coincidental. Jollof rice, perhaps the most celebrated rice dish in West Africa, bears a clear family resemblance to jambalaya. Both are one-pot rice dishes cooked with tomatoes, peppers, onions, and whatever protein is available. Both rely on technique as much as ingredients, on knowing how to layer flavors and control heat, so the rice comes out tender but distinct, never mushy, never raw. The connection isn't speculative, it's written in the recipes themselves. Now, let's move forward in time, because soul food didn't stop evolving when slavery ended. In some ways, the most important chapters were yet to come. The end of slavery in 1865 didn't mean the end of hardship. It didn't mean the sudden appearance of fully stocked kitchens and well-appointed dining rooms. For most formerly enslaved people, freedom arrived with empty pockets, no land, and a political system that was already devising new ways to control black labor and limit black prosperity. Sharecropping replaced slavery as the dominant economic arrangement across the rural South, and in many practical ways, the food situation didn't change as dramatically as the legal situation did. Sharecroppers were still poor. They were still dependent on corn and pork as staples. They still grew gardens to supplement what little they could afford to buy. But there was one critical difference. The food was now theirs. The garden was theirs. The choices about what to cook, how to cook it, when to eat, and who to share it with were theirs. And with that ownership came a transformation. The cooking of the quarters became the cooking of a free people, still shaped by the same ingredients and techniques, but now imbued with a different meaning. Food was no longer just survival, it was identity. The period between the end of the Civil War and the early 20th century, roughly the Reconstruction era and its long, bitter aftermath, was when soul food evolved from a survival diet into a cultural phenomenon. And the engine of that evolution was the black church. If you want to understand soul food, you have to understand the church. In post-emancipation black communities across the South, the church was everything. It was the social center, the political meeting ground, the school, the mutual aid society, and the place where the community gathered to be together in a way that the broader society made difficult or dangerous everywhere else. And at the center of every church gathering was food. Church dinners became the signature communal meal of black, a dish. The long tables would be covered a dish. The long tables would be covered with platters and bowls and cast iron pots containing the full range of what we now recognize as soul food. Fried chicken, collard greens, macaroni and cheese, cornbread, sweet potato pie, candied yams, black-eyed peas, potato salad, banana pudding, peach cobbler. The spread was abundant, and the abundance itself was a statement. We are free, we are together, and we can feed ourselves. The church dinner was also where cooking reputations were made. In a community where professional opportunities were violently restricted, culinary skill was a form of social capital. The woman who made the best fried chicken, the one whose pie crust was so light it practically floated off the plate, the grandmother whose macaroni and cheese was so rich and golden that children fought for the corner piece with the extra crust. These women were celebrated. Their knowledge was sought after. Their dishes were requested by name. And the gentle but fierce competition among church cooks pushed the cuisine forward, refining techniques and flavors generation after generation. Let's be clear about the economics here, because economics are always part of the food story. Black Southerners in the decades after emancipation were, on the whole, desperately poor. The food they cooked reflected that poverty. It was built on inexpensive ingredients: cornmeal, pork, greens, beans, potatoes. It relied on techniques that stretched a little into a lot, that turned tough, cheap cuts of meat into tender, flavorful dishes through patience and slow cooking. It was, in the parlance of the modern food world, peasant cooking. And like all great peasant cuisines, its brilliance lay in what it did with limitation. But the poverty was not natural. It was engineered. Sharecropping kept black farmers in permanent debt. Jim Crow laws restricted black access to credit, to markets, to land ownership. The food traditions that emerged from this period weren't just a response to poverty. They were a response to a system that deliberately kept people poor and then derided them for eating poor people's food. There's a particular cruelty in that logic, and understanding it is essential to understanding why soul food carries such deep emotional weight. Every pot of greens, every skillet of cornbread, every plate of neck bones and beans carries within it a history of people who were systematically denied resources and who responded by creating something extraordinary from whatever they had. And then came the Great Migration, and everything changed again. Between roughly 1910 and 1970, more than 6 million black Americans left the rural South for the cities of the Northwest and Midwest. They went to Chicago and Detroit and New York and Los Angeles and Philadelphia and Cleveland and 100 other cities, looking for jobs, looking for safety, looking for something that resembled the freedom they'd been promised and consistently denied. They brought their clothes and their Bibles and their memories. And they brought their food. Picture this. It's 1925 and you've just arrived in Chicago from Mississippi. You've taken the train north, packed into a segregated car with your suitcase and a cardboard box that your mother insisted you take. Inside the box, wrapped in newspaper and old cloth, there's a jar of preserved peaches, a sack of cornmeal, and a cast iron skillet. The skillet is heavy enough that it made your arm ache the entire trip. But you carried it anyway, because that skillet has cooked 1,000 meals and carries the seasoning of 20 years of your mother's cooking, and leaving it behind was simply not an option. You arrive in Bronzeville, Chicago's Black Belt, and the city hits you with everything at once. The noise, the cold, the concrete, the sheer density of people living on top of each other in ways you never imagined back home. You find a room in a kitchenette apartment, which is a generous name for a single room with a hot plate and a shared bathroom down the hall. There's no yard, there's no garden plot, there's no creek to fish and no woods to hunt in. The cornfields and cotton fields and sweet potato patches are 1,000 miles south, and the ache for them is physical, a hunger that goes deeper than the stomach. So you cook. You find the nearest market where somebody's selling greens and sweet potatoes and cornmeal and whatever cuts of pork the white-owned butcher shops won't carry. You fire up that hot plate and you make cornbread in your mother's skillet. It doesn't taste quite the same. The cornmeal is different. The water is different. The heat isn't right. But it's close. Close enough to feel like a hand on your shoulder from 1,000 miles away. The Great Migration created a massive demand for Southern food in northern cities, and black entrepreneurs rushed to meet it. Soul food restaurants began opening across the black neighborhoods of every major northern city. These weren't fancy establishments. Many of them were barely a step above someone's kitchen. A storefront with a counter and a few stools. A woman in the back frying chicken and simmering greens the same way her mother had done it in Alabama. But they were lifelines. For the millions of black Southerners displaced by the migration, these restaurants offered something no amount of northern ambition could replace: the taste of home. In Harlem, soul food restaurants became gathering places for the artists and musicians of the Renaissance. In Chicago's Bronzeville, they fed factory workers coming off shifts and church congregations after Sunday services. They were the places where you could sit down with a plate of oxtails and rice and greens and cornbread and, for the duration of that meal, be transported back to a porch in Georgia, a kitchen in Tennessee, a churchyard in Alabama. The food was memory. It was connection. It was proof that no matter how far north you traveled, you carried the South inside you. But the migration also created tensions around food that were new and complicated. Some black Northerners, particularly those who'd been in the cities for a generation or more, looked down on the food traditions of the Southern newcomers. Eating chitlins and greens and cornbread was seen by some as backward, rural, embarrassingly connected to the poverty and oppression the migration was supposed to leave behind. In the 1930s, a journalist in New York's Amsterdam News claimed that Harlem residents rejected what he called the fried chicken, pork chop, hogmaw, and chitterlings theories that assumed all black people wanted to eat country food. There was a class divide embedded in the food, and it would take decades to resolve. The resolution came fittingly during one of the most important political and cultural movements in American history. The civil rights movement didn't just change laws. It changed how black Americans thought about their own culture, their own history, and their own food. The term soul food itself didn't enter common usage until the mid-1960s. During the Black Power movement, when soul became a word that encompassed everything distinctly Black American. Soul music, soul brother, soul sister, and soul food. The food that had been dismissed as slave food or country food was reclaimed as a source of pride. It wasn't poor people's food anymore. It was soul food. It was the culinary expression of a people's resilience, creativity, and cultural identity. One of the first recorded uses of the term appeared in the autobiography of Malcolm X in 1965. The journalist Gertrude Gibson had used it a few years earlier in the Los Angeles Sentinel. And suddenly, what had been a source of shame for some became a point of celebration for many. Soul food restaurants weren't just places to eat. They were cultural institutions. Sylvia Woods opened her restaurant on Malcolm X Boulevard in Harlem in 1962, and it became one of the most famous soul food establishments in the world, eventually earning her the title Queen of Soul Food. In Atlanta, Pascal's restaurant became a meeting place for civil rights leaders. In Chicago, Edna's fed the movement. These restaurants served plates of food and plates of community. They were where strategies were discussed, where volunteers were fed, where the work of changing a nation was fueled by fried chicken and greens and sweet tea. The civil rights era also saw the emergence of the Chitlin Circuit, the network of Black-owned nightclubs, performance venues, and restaurants that sustained Black entertainers during the Jim Crow era. The name itself, borrowed from chitterlings, the dish that had become a kind of shorthand for Black Southern food culture, tells you everything about the relationship between soul food and Black cultural life. The music and the food were inseparable. The blues clubs served ribs. The jazz joints served catfish. The gospel brunches served fried chicken and waffles, a combination that became popular among Black musicians and singers who performed late into the night and needed a meal that bridged the gap between dinner and breakfast. The connection between soul food and the Black Panther Party deserves a mention here because it complicates the narrative in an important way. The Panthers' Free Breakfast for Children program, launched in 1969, served meals to thousands of hungry kids in Black communities across the country. The food was simple: eggs, bacon, grits, toast, orange juice. It was, in its own way, soul food stripped to its most essential purpose, nourishing Black children that the American government had failed to feed. The program was so effective and so politically threatening that the FBI actively tried to shut it down. When free breakfast for children is considered a national security threat, you know the food is doing something more powerful than just filling stomachs. But the soul food story wasn't all celebration. Alongside the cultural reclamation came legitimate health concerns. The traditional preparation methods, heavy on pork fat, salt, frying, and sugar, were contributing to health disparities that were themselves rooted in the economics of oppression. Hypertension, diabetes, heart disease. These conditions were ravaging Black communities at disproportionate rates, and the diet was a contributing factor. Here's where the conversation gets nuanced, and it's important to hold both truths at the same time. Soul food, as traditionally prepared and consumed in large quantities, can be harmful to health. That's a fact. But it's also a fact that the health disparities in Black communities are not solely, or even primarily, the fault of diet. They're the result of centuries of systemic racism that has produced food deserts, limited healthcare access, environmental racism, chronic stress, and economic deprivation. Blaming soul food for Black health problems without acknowledging the systems that created those problems is like blaming the lifeboat for the shipwreck. And here's the other thing the critics often miss. The everyday soul food diet was never as heavy or as rich as the holiday spread suggests. Grandmothers who cooked these meals will tell you that fried chicken was Sunday food. The gospel bird was for special occasions. On regular days, the meal was greens, beans, cornbread, vegetables and grain. Not so different, in fact, from the plant-heavy diets that West Africans had eaten for centuries before the slave trade introduced the heavy reliance on pork that became soul food's most controversial feature. The pre-colonial African diet was largely plant-based, centered on vegetables, starches and legumes, with meat used more as a seasoning than a main course. The heavy meat and fat that characterize soul food as it's commonly understood are, in part, a product of slavery itself, of a system that provided pork as the primary source of protein and rationed everything else. Modern soul food is reckoning with this history. Chefs and home cooks across the country are reaching back past the plantation, past the ration line, to the African roots of the tradition, finding ways to honor the cuisine while adapting it for contemporary health concerns. Smoked turkey replacing pork. Plant-based preparations influenced by African and Caribbean traditions. Vegetables moving from the side of the plate to the center. The cuisine is evolving, as it has always evolved, as it must, if it's to remain alive. Let's come back to the kitchen for a moment. Let's come back to the sensory experience of soul food cooking, because that's what the listener is here for, and it's where the tradition lives most vividly. Imagine you're standing in a kitchen in rural Alabama, sometime in the early 20th century. The stove is a wood-burning cast iron, range, the kind that heats the entire room even in summer. The kitchen smells like life itself. There's a pot of greens that's been simmering since morning, the ham hock dissolving into the liquid, the collard leaves dark and tender and glistening with fat. On the stove, a skillet of cornbread is baking, and you can tell it's almost done because the edges have pulled away from the sides of the pan, and the top has turned a golden brown that catches the light from the window. There's a rhythm to this kitchen. The cook moves with a practiced efficiency that makes every motion purposeful. She doesn't measure. She pinches salt from a bowl. She pours oil until it looks right. She tests the heat of the oven by putting her hand inside and counting. This is cooking by feel, by intuition, by a body of knowledge so deeply absorbed that it doesn't require conscious thought. It's in the hands. It's in the wrist action when she stirs the pot. It's in the way she tilts the skillet just so, letting the cornbread batter run to the edges and settle into an even layer. The fried chicken is happening in another skillet, a deep one, heavy as an anchor, filled with shimmering lard that's reached the exact temperature, where a sprinkle of flour sizzles and dances on the surface. The chicken has been soaking in buttermilk and seasoned with salt and pepper and cayenne. She dredges each piece in seasoned flour, and the coating clings, building up in craggy peaks and valleys that will crisp into the most satisfying crunch you've ever heard. The chicken goes into the oil, and the sound is immediate and glorious. A crackling, popping, hissing symphony that fills the kitchen and announces to everyone within earshot that something extraordinary is happening. And the sweet potatoes, they're baking in the oven, whole, their skins splitting from the heat, the orange flesh inside turning caramelized and almost candy sweet. Later, she'll peel them and mash them with butter and cinnamon and a little brown sugar and maybe some nutmeg, and they'll go into a pie crust that she rolled out by hand on a floured board, or they'll be layered into a baking dish and covered with a crumble of sugar and butter and baked until the top is burnished and bubbly. Either way, the sweet potatoes will be the dish that everyone fights over. The one that has second and third servings claimed before the first serving is even on the table. The biscuits. We haven't talked about biscuits yet, and that's an oversight. Biscuits in a soul food kitchen are not the sad, dense hockey pucks that the grocery store sells in a tube. They're works of art. Flour, lard or butter, buttermilk, a pinch of salt, and a touch of baking powder. Mixed quickly with cold hands because overworking the dough makes them tough. Patted out, never rolled, and cut with a sharp biscuit cutter or the rim of a glass. They go into a hot oven and they rise, flaky and layered and golden. And when you split one open, the steam escapes and you can see the butter pooling in the crevices. You eat them with butter. You eat them with sorghum syrup. You eat them sopped in pot liquor or gravy. You eat them because they're the single most perfect delivery system for flavor that Southern cooking has ever devised. Let's talk about seasoning for a moment, because seasoning is where the African soul in soul food makes itself most powerfully known. There's a persistent myth in American food culture that Southern food is simple. Meat, fat, salt. That's the caricature. But anyone who's actually eaten soul food, prepared by someone who knows what they're doing, will tell you that the flavoring is anything but simple. It's layered. It's built from the bottom up. It starts with the fat, which is not just a cooking medium, but a flavoring agent in its own right. Pork fat, bacon grease, saved in a coffee can on the back of the stove. This is the base note. It carries flavor into everything it touches. Then comes the aromatic foundation. Onions, garlic, celery, maybe bell pepper if you're in Louisiana. These get cooked down slowly until they're soft and sweet and fragrant. This is the same technique used across West African cooking, where building a flavor base of alliums and aromatics is the first step in nearly every dish. It's the same principle behind the French mirepoix and the Cajun Holy Trinity, which itself was almost certainly influenced by West African cooking via the enslaved cooks of Louisiana. Then the heat. Soul food without heat is like gospel music without feeling. It might technically be the same notes, but something essential is missing. Hot peppers have been central to African cooking for centuries, and they came to the American South with the people who knew how to use them. Cayenne pepper, red pepper flakes, hot sauce, both the commercially produced kind that appeared in the late 19th century and the homemade vinegar and pepper solutions that enslaved cooks had been making since the colonial period. The heat in soul food isn't there to burn your mouth. It's there to wake up every other flavor in the dish. It's functional. It serves a purpose. And the people who use it know exactly how much is right for any given dish. Then come the finishing flavors. Vinegar, which brightens greens and cuts through fat. Sugar or molasses, which rounds out bitterness and adds complexity. Smoked meat, which contributes a depth of flavor that can't be replicated by any other method. And thyme. Thyme is the ultimate seasoning in soul food. The greens that cook for 3 hours taste different from the greens that cook for 1. The meat that simmers all day develops a richness that no amount of high-heat cooking can produce. Soul food is slow food, not because someone trademarked the concept, but because the techniques demand patience and reward it. The seasoning philosophy of soul food is fundamentally different from the European tradition that dominates mainstream American cooking. In European cooking, especially the French tradition that became the gold standard for fine dining, the goal is often to showcase the ingredient itself. The steak should taste like steak. The fish should taste like fish. Seasoning exists to enhance the natural flavor of the primary ingredient. In soul food, the goal is different. The goal is to transform, to take an ingredient that might be tough or bland or unappetizing on its own, and through a combination of technique and seasoning, turn it into something magnificent. The ham hock that started as a discarded joint becomes the soul of a pot of greens. The chitlins that began as intestines become tender and savory, and yes, delicious, when cleaned and seasoned and cooked with care. This isn't cooking that showcases ingredients. This is cooking that performs miracles on them. And that brings us to the concept of pot cooking, which is perhaps the most essential technique in the entire soul food tradition. The one-pot meal, the big pot of something that simmers all day and feeds everyone. In West African cooking, the one-pot stew is foundational. You build flavor in layers, you add whatever proteins and vegetables are available, and you let the pot do the work of combining and concentrating those flavors over time. This approach made the journey across the Atlantic intact, and it became the backbone of enslaved cooking in the South. One pot, one fire, whatever ingredients you have, time and patience and skill. The technique survives in every major soul food dish that involves liquid. Greens cooked in pot liquor, beans simmered with pork, stews and gumbos that combine multiple proteins with vegetables and rice, the Sunday pot that gathered whatever the week had offered and transformed it into something greater than the sum of its parts. The one-pot approach was practical, conserving both fuel and cookware, but it was also profoundly delicious, because slow combining of ingredients in a single vessel produces a kind of flavor alchemy that faster, more separate cooking methods can't achieve. Now let's talk about some dishes that don't always get the attention they deserve. Chitlins. Let's address them directly, because no conversation about soul food is complete without them, and no dish in the tradition carries more cultural weight. Chitterlings, the small intestines of a pig, cleaned and cooked, are either a source of deep nostalgia or deep discomfort, depending on who you ask. The smell of chitlins cooking is notorious. It's pungent, earthy, and unmistakable. People who love them fiercely. People who don't understand them cannot fathom why anyone would. Here's what they represent. Chitlins are the ultimate expression of the soul food principle. Take what nobody wants and make it into something. The enslaver kept the hams, the loins, the chops. The intestines went to the quarters, and the people in the quarters cleaned them with extraordinary labor and patience, and cooked them until they were tender, and ate them with hot sauce and vinegar. And they were good. They were theirs. Nobody else wanted them, which meant nobody else could take them away. There's a defiant pride in chitlins that goes beyond flavor. Eating them is a cultural statement. It says, we took the worst you gave us and we made it a tradition. You meant it as degradation. We turned it into cuisine. The Chitlin Circuit, that network of black entertainment venues that sustained black artists during Jim Crow, took its name from this dish. That tells you something about the symbolic power of chitterlings in black culture. They're not just food. They're an identity marker, a test of cultural belonging, a bridge between the past and the present. Catfish, the people's fish. In the rural South, catfish was one of the most accessible sources of protein for black communities. You could catch it in any creek, pond, or river. You didn't need expensive equipment. A line, a hook, and some patience were enough. Catfish was the fish of the working class, the bottom feeder that fed the people at the bottom of the social hierarchy. And like everything else in this tradition, it was transformed by skill and seasoning into something extraordinary. Fried catfish in the soul food tradition is a sensory event. The fish is cleaned and filleted, then soaked in buttermilk to remove any muddy flavor. It's dredged in seasoned cornmeal, heavy on the salt and pepper and cayenne, and fried in hot oil until the crust is golden and shattering, and the flesh inside is white and flaky and steaming. You eat it with hot sauce. You eat it with coleslaw. You eat it with hush puppies, those little balls of cornmeal batter deep fried until they're crispy on the outside and tender inside, supposedly named because cooks would toss them to barking dogs with the command hush, puppy to keep the animals quiet while the fish was frying. The fish fry became a social institution in its own right. Like the church dinner, it was a community event. Somebody would set up a deep fryer, usually outdoors, and neighbors would gather with their catch. The oil would be heating in a big pot while someone mixed the cornmeal batter and someone else made the coleslaw. Children ran around underfoot. Adults told stories. The fish came out of the oil golden and perfect, eaten standing up, with your fingers, grease running down your forearms. And for those hours, the world contracted to this gathering, this food, this community. Macaroni and cheese in the soul food tradition is different from the box stuff, and it's different from the white cheddar baked pasta you might find in a fancier restaurant. Soul food mac and cheese is an event. It starts with elbow macaroni, cooked until just tender. Then comes the cheese, and this is where every family has its own closely guarded formula. Sharp cheddar is the base. Often there's Velveeta in there too, for creaminess, though admitting this in some circles is akin to confessing a crime. Eggs and evaporated milk form a custard that binds everything together. There might be mustard powder, or a pinch of cayenne, or a layer of extra cheese on top that bakes into a bubbly golden crust. It goes into the oven and comes out a casserole, firm enough to cut into squares but creamy in the center. And it is, for many people, the single most important dish on the soul food table. Thanksgiving without macaroni and cheese isn't Thanksgiving. A funeral repast without it is unthinkable. The origins of mac and cheese in the black tradition trace back to the big house kitchen, where enslaved cooks encountered European pasta preparations and adapted them. They made them richer, more heavily seasoned, more indulgent. They transformed a relatively simple dish into something that carried emotional weight. Mac and cheese at a soul food gathering isn't a side dish. It's a love language. Banana pudding, peach cobbler, sweet potato pie. The desserts of the soul food tradition deserve respect and attention. They're not afterthoughts. They're essential, and each one carries its own history. Sweet potato pie is the soul food answer to pumpkin pie, and in many households, it's not a substitute, but the original. The filling is simpler than you'd think. Mashed sweet potatoes, butter, sugar, eggs, milk, and spices. Cinnamon, nutmeg, sometimes vanilla. It goes into a pie crust and bakes until the filling is set, and the top has developed a slightly darker skin that cracks when you slice into it. The flavor is deeper and more complex than pumpkin pie, earthier, sweeter, with a caramel undertone that comes from the natural sugars in the sweet potato. Every Thanksgiving table in a black household has a sweet potato pie. Not having one would be like forgetting to set a place for the most important guest. Peach cobbler connects the soul food tradition to the agriculture of the South. Peaches grew abundantly across the region, and enslaved people had access to them, whether from orchards on the plantation or from wild trees. Lewis Hughes described the making of peach cobbler at plantation feasts. Layers of crust and fresh peaches and sugar, baked in Dutch ovens set over beds of coals. The technique has barely changed. Modern peach cobbler is still, at its core, fruit and pastry and sugar, baked until the fruit is bubbling and the crust is golden. It's served warm, ideally with vanilla ice cream, though historically it was eaten plain or with fresh cream if you could get it. The first bite, when the warm, syrupy fruit meets the flaky, buttery crust, is one of those sensory experiences that lodges in memory and refuses to leave. Banana pudding is a more recent addition to the canon, arriving after bananas became widely available in the American South in the late 19th century. But it's been adopted so thoroughly that it now occupies a position of prominence on any soul food dessert table. Layers of vanilla wafers, sliced bananas and custard, sometimes topped with meringue and sometimes with whipped cream. It's the kind of dessert that disappears before you can get to it. The vanilla wafers soften as they absorb the custard, creating a texture that's somewhere between cake and pudding. The bananas add sweetness and a tropical note that somehow feels right alongside the heavier, earthier desserts on the table. Let's step back and look at the table as a whole, because soul food has never been about individual dishes in isolation. It's about the spread, the gathering, the table that's covered edge to edge with dishes that represent different families, different traditions, different generations of cooking knowledge. At a soul food gathering, whether it's a church dinner, a family reunion, a funeral repast, or a holiday meal, the table is the center of the experience, and the table is always abundant. Even if every individual dish was made from humble ingredients, the collective effect is one of generosity and plenty. This abundance is not accidental. It's intentional. It's a deliberate rejection of scarcity. For a people whose history is defined in large part by not having enough, the full table is a statement. We have enough. We have more than enough. Come, sit down, eat. The social rituals around the table are as important as the food itself. Elders eat first, or at least serve first. Grace is said, and it's not perfunctory. The prayer acknowledges the food, the hands that prepared it, and the history that brought everyone to this moment. Children are fed and watched over by the entire community, not just their parents. Conversations flow between the generations, stories are told, and the act of eating together reinforces bonds that hold the community together. Leftovers are not waste. They're a currency of care. You don't leave a soul food gathering without a plate, the host insists. The tinfoil comes out. The plastic containers are stacked and filled. You take food home for the people who couldn't come, the elderly, neighbor, the cousin working a late shift, the friend going through a hard time. The food extends the gathering beyond the table and into the week that follows. Monday's lunch is Sunday's fried chicken, cold, eaten standing at the counter, and somehow even better the second day. This is what soul food is, at its most fundamental. It's not a list of dishes. It's not a set of ingredients. It's a way of being in relationship with food and with each other that grew out of the most difficult circumstances imaginable and became, against all odds, a source of joy, pride, and connection. It's a tradition that turns scraps into sustenance, sustenance into cuisine, and cuisine into culture. And every time someone sits down to a plate of greens and cornbread and fried chicken, they're participating in a story that stretches back centuries, across an ocean, through slavery and freedom, through loss and rebuilding, through grief and celebration, all the way to this moment, this table, this meal. And here's the thing about the soul food table that people outside the tradition sometimes miss. There are rules, unspoken, rarely written down, but absolutely real. The potato salad, for instance, has caused more family arguments than inheritance disputes. Every family has its recipe. Every family believes their recipe is the correct one. Some families put eggs in their potato salad. Others consider eggs an offense against nature and decency. Some add pickle relish. Others add sweet pickles. Some add mustard. Some would sooner burn the kitchen down than put mustard in potato salad. The debate is fierce, loving, and eternal. It has no resolution, and it doesn't need one, because the argument itself is part of the tradition. The arguing over potato salad is how families teach their children what matters: loyalty, specificity, and the courage to defend your grandmother's recipe against all challenges. Cornbread generates the same passion. Sugar or no sugar? This is not a casual question. In some regions of the South, putting sugar in cornbread is considered a legitimate ground for divorce. Sweet cornbread is sometimes dismissed as cake masquerading as bread. Unsweetened cornbread, on the other hand, is defended as the only authentic version, the kind your great-grandmother made, crispy and golden and salty and cooked in a cast iron skillet that's been preheated in the oven until it's smoking. The batter hits the hot skillet and sizzles, and that sizzle creates the crust. The crust is everything. And if you don't have that crust, you don't have cornbread. You have disappointment. The hot water cornbread deserves a separate mention. This is cornbread at its most elemental. Cornmeal, salt, boiling water. Mix it into a thick batter, drop spoonfuls into hot oil, and fry until golden. The result is a small, dense, incredibly satisfying bread that is simultaneously crispy on the outside and pillowy in the center. Hot water cornbread is the ancestor of hush puppies, the survivor of the simplest possible cooking conditions, and one of the most underappreciated dishes in the entire soul food canon. It requires no eggs, no butter, no milk, no sugar, just corn and water and fire. And it is proof that you don't need expensive ingredients to make food that is deeply, fundamentally good. Let's talk about the role of pork in the tradition, because pork is simultaneously the most essential and the most complicated ingredient in soul food history. The relationship between black Southerners and pork was established by slavery. Pork was the cheapest meat to produce, pigs foraged easily and required minimal care, and the planter class distributed the least desirable parts to the enslaved workforce. Over generations, these cast-off cuts became culinary staples. Ham hocks, fatback, salt pork, bacon, pig feet, pig ears, neck bones. Each one became a building block of the cuisine. But pork in soul food isn't usually the main event. It's the seasoning. A ham hock doesn't sit in the center of the plate. It sits in the pot of greens, slowly dissolving its collagen and fat and smoke into the cooking liquid, transforming vegetables into something richer and more complex. A piece of fatback goes into the pot of beans, rendering out its fat and leaving behind a flavor that can't be replicated by any other ingredient. Salt pork gets fried until crispy and crumbled over cornbread or mixed into stuffing. The pig, in soul food, is less a protein and more a flavor delivery system, a way of adding depth and richness to dishes that would otherwise be relatively plain. This understanding of pork as seasoning rather than centerpiece connects directly to West African cooking traditions, where meat was traditionally used sparingly as a flavoring agent for predominantly plant-based dishes. It was the conditions of American slavery, where pork was the primary protein available, that elevated meat to a more central role. And it's the return to that original African understanding, meat as seasoning, vegetables as main event, that's driving much of the modern reimagining of soul food. Let's also talk about drinks, because soul food doesn't exist in a liquid vacuum. Sweet tea is the water of the South, the universal beverage, served at every meal and between meals, and as a gesture of hospitality to anyone who crosses your threshold. Making sweet tea properly is its own art. The tea must be brewed strong and the sugar must be dissolved while the tea is still hot, because sweet tea is not the same as tea with sugar added after the fact. That distinction matters more than you might think. Tea sweetened while hot has a different, smoother sweetness than tea that's been sweetened cold. And anyone who's grown up drinking the real thing can tell the difference in a single sip. Lemonade has its own tradition. Church lemonade, the kind served at fish fries and picnics and church gatherings, is usually made with fresh lemons and more sugar than any nutritionist would recommend, and it is glorious. Kool-Aid became a staple of black households when it became widely available in the mid-20th century, and it occupies a complicated cultural space. On one hand, it's a cheap, heavily sugared drink marketed to poor communities. On the other hand, it's a source of childhood nostalgia and a genuine part of the cultural landscape. Red Kool-Aid, specifically, has become an almost iconic symbol of black childhood summer, served in plastic pitchers at barbecues and block parties and family reunions. And then there's the tradition of home-brewed beverages that stretches back to the quarters. Persimmon beer, molasses water, ginger tea, sassafras tea, made from the roots of the sassafras tree and believed to have medicinal properties. These drinks connected the enslaved community to the natural world around them and to African traditions of herbal medicine and fermentation. The knowledge of which plants made good tea, which roots could be brewed into beer, which herbs settled the stomach or eased a headache, this was community knowledge held primarily by older women and passed down with the same care as the cooking traditions. Now, one more dish that we absolutely cannot overlook: red velvet cake. This dessert has become so associated with black celebrations that it's practically a cultural symbol. The deep red color, the cream cheese frosting, the moist, tender crumb. Red velvet cake shows up at every major event in black community life: weddings, birthdays, church anniversaries, graduations. Its origins are debated, but what's not debated is its significance. A red velvet cake on the table means this occasion matters. It means somebody spent the time and the effort, and probably the grocery money, to make something beautiful. It means this gathering is worth celebrating. The tradition of elaborate desserts at black celebrations speaks to something larger about the role of food in the community. In a society that has consistently denied black people access to luxury, comfort, and beauty, the soul food table has always been a space where those things could exist. A 3-layer cake with perfect frosting is a luxury. A perfectly browned pie is a work of art. A table full of dishes, each one made by a different person, each one representing a family's best effort, is a kind of abundance that money can't buy and oppression can't prevent. The soul food table has always been one of the few spaces where black Americans could enact wealth in its truest sense. The wealth of community, of care, of flavor, of love made visible and edible. Let's spend a moment with the women, because we cannot talk about soul food without acknowledging that this is overwhelmingly a tradition built by women. The cooks in the quarters were women. The cooks in the big house kitchen were women. The church cooks are women. The grandmothers who hold the recipes are women. The hands that stir the pot, the eyes that judge the color of the oil, the instinct that knows when the cornbread is done without a timer or a thermometer, these belong predominantly to black women. This doesn't diminish the contributions of black men to the tradition. The barbecue pit masters, the trail cooks, the fishermen, the hunters who brought protein home for their families. But the day-to-day, meal-by-meal, generation-by-generation work of creating and sustaining soul food has been women's work. and it has been both celebrated and taken for granted in the way that women's work often is. The grandmother who spends all day Saturday cooking for Sunday dinner doesn't get a paycheck. The church mother who coordinates the feeding of 200 people doesn't get a line in any history book. The mother who teaches her daughter to make biscuits, standing beside her at the counter, guiding her hands, isn't credited as an educator. But she is one, and the education she provides is as valuable and as lasting as any degree. The soul food kitchen is a classroom, a laboratory, a temple, and a stage. It's where black women have exercised authority in a world that denies them authority elsewhere, where their skill is undeniable, their knowledge irreplaceable, and their presence essential. The grandmother at the head of the kitchen is the matriarch. Her word on matters of cooking is final. Her cornbread is the standard against which all other cornbread is measured. Her fried chicken is the platonic ideal, and her recipes, whether written on a stained index card or held entirely in memory, are family heirlooms more precious than any piece of jewelry. And there's another piece of the soul food story that we need to sit with for a moment. The Green Book. During the Jim Crow era, when it was genuinely dangerous for black Americans to travel on American roads, a Harlem postal worker named Victor Hugo Green created a travel guide listing the places where black travelers could safely eat, sleep, and get gasoline without being refused, service, harassed, or worse. Several of those safe havens were soul food restaurants. These weren't just places to eat. They were oases. They were the difference between a terrifying road trip and one where you could sit down, have a hot meal, and feel like a human being for an hour before getting back on the highway and hoping the next town wouldn't kill you. Think about that for a second. Let that settle in your chest for a moment, because it should sit heavy there. In a country that proclaimed liberty and justice for all, that carved those words into stone monuments and printed them on currency, black families needed a special book just to find a place to eat lunch without risking their lives. A family driving from Alabama to Ohio for a funeral couldn't just pull over at the next diner and order a sandwich. They packed food in shoeboxes, fried chicken wrapped in wax paper, biscuits, boiled eggs, because they knew that between their front door and their destination there might not be a single establishment willing to serve them. And the restaurants that were listed, the ones that opened their doors and served their food and offered a moment of safety, they were doing something more than running a business. They were providing sanctuary. A plate of fried chicken and greens in a Green Book restaurant wasn't just dinner. It was proof that somewhere, someone was willing to feed you and treat you like a person, in a country that treated you like something less. The Green Book restaurants also served another function. They were nodes in a network of black enterprise and mutual support. They kept money circulating within black communities. They provided employment. They maintained cooking traditions. They were proof that black economic self-sufficiency was possible even under the most hostile conditions. Some of them became legendary. Sweats in Nashville opened in 1954 and was listed in the Green Book. It's still serving food today, 3 generations later. Think about the continuity that represents. The same recipes, the same tradition, the same commitment to feeding people, surviving through the civil rights era, through urban renewal, through gentrification, through everything the decades threw at it. The relationship between soul food and barbecue also needs a word, because the two traditions are deeply intertwined but not identical. Barbecue in America owes enormous debts to African and African American culinary traditions. The technique of slow cooking meat over wood coals, basting with vinegar and pepper sauces, managing the fire to produce smoke rather than flame, These are skills that enslaved cooks developed and refined over centuries. Barbecue was the centerpiece of plantation feasts, both the ones the planter hosted for white guests and the ones held in the quarters for the enslaved community. After emancipation, barbecue became one of the first avenues of black entrepreneurship. A man with a pit, a woodpile, and hard-earned skill could set up a stand at a crossroads or beside a church and sell plates to anyone with an appetite and a few coins. The startup costs were minimal. The expertise required was vast. You needed to understand wood, which types burned hot and fast, and which burned low and slow, which species produced the right flavor of smoke for pork versus beef versus poultry. You needed to understand fire itself, how to build it, how to bank it, how to read the color and behavior of the coals the way a sailor reads the wind. You needed patience measured not in minutes, but in hours, sometimes from midnight until midday. Black barbecue pitmasters became legendary figures in their communities, known by name and by reputation, sought out by people willing to drive considerable distances for the right plate of ribs or pulled pork or brisket. The barbecue tradition is related to soul food, shares many of the same ingredients and techniques, but it carries its own distinct identity and its own culture of competition, pride, and closely guarded family secrets. Pulled pork, ribs, smoked sausage, brisket in Texas. These are the products of a tradition that began with enslaved people cooking over open pits, and that has evolved into one of America's most celebrated food cultures. And like soul food, the credit for creating these traditions has often been denied to the black cooks who invented them. The narrative of American barbecue has been whitewashed, sometimes literally, with white pitmasters and restaurant owners building empires on techniques pioneered by black men and women who never received the recognition they deserved. But the knowledge persists, in family traditions, in community cookouts, in the backyard where somebody's uncle has been tending the smoker since 5 a.m. and won't let anyone else near it because he knows in his bones exactly when the meat is ready. That knowledge didn't come from a book. It came from his father, who got it from his father, who got it from someone whose name has been lost to history, but whose skill has not. The chain of knowledge is unbroken. The fire is still burning very brightly, and the food is still extraordinary. Now let's take a journey through the regional variations of soul food, because one of the most fascinating things about this tradition is that it isn't monolithic. Soul food in the Carolina Lowcountry tastes different from soul food in Mississippi, which tastes different from soul food in Alabama, which tastes different from what you'll find in a black kitchen in East Texas. The core ingredients overlap, but the preparations, the seasonings, the secondary ingredients, and the local traditions create a tapestry of regional flavors that's as rich and varied as any European wine map. In the Carolina Lowcountry, rice is the foundation. This is where the African rice-growing expertise left its deepest mark, and the dishes that emerged reflect that legacy. Palu, a rice dish cooked with whatever meat and vegetables are available, is a direct descendant of West African rice preparations. Red rice, cooked with tomatoes and onions and sausage, is a low-country staple that you won't find with the same frequency in other soul food regions. Shrimp and grits draws on the coastal resources and the Native American corn tradition simultaneously. The Lowcountry also has a stronger seafood tradition than inland soul food regions, for obvious reasons. Oyster roasts, crab boils, fried shrimp. The ocean and the marshes provided protein that supplemented and sometimes replaced the pork-heavy diet of the inland South. In Louisiana, the African, French, Spanish, and Native American influences collide in ways that produce Creole and Cajun cooking. Traditions that overlap with soul food in significant ways, but also stand apart. Gumbo, the dish that takes its name from the West African word for okra, is the signature example. It's a one-pot dish that can contain virtually anything: chicken, sausage, shrimp, okra, file powder from sassafras leaves, tomatoes. It's served over rice naturally, and it's infinitely variable. No two gumbo recipes are identical, and the debate over what belongs in a proper gumbo is a conversation that has no end and no winners, only passionate participants. Red beans and rice became a Monday tradition in Black New Orleans households, a habit born from practicality. Monday was wash day, the most labor-intensive day of the domestic week, and red beans could simmer unattended on the back of the stove while the laundry was being done. Seasoned with pork, onion, garlic, and whatever hot sauce was on the table, red beans and rice became one of the most satisfying and economical meals in the entire soul food tradition. Louis Armstrong, the legendary jazz musician from New Orleans, loved the dish so much that he reportedly signed his letters "Red Beans and Ricely Yours." In Mississippi and Alabama, the soul food tradition tends toward the hearty and the straightforward. Fried chicken, catfish, greens cooked for hours, cornbread made without sugar, a point of significant regional controversy. In Mississippi, you might find chitlins served with greater frequency than in other regions, and the pig roast, where the whole animal is cooked over a wood pit, carries particular cultural significance. Alabama contributes its own variation on barbecue, with pulled pork and vinegar-based sauces that reflect a seasoning tradition stretching back to the earliest African-American cooks. In Georgia, the peach takes on an almost totemic significance, appearing in cobblers and preserves and pies. Georgia's proximity to the coast adds seafood to the soul food table, particularly in Savannah, where the low country influence is strong. Further inland, the soul food leans heavier on pork and poultry, with a particular fondness for smoked meats that connects to the region's deep barbecue tradition. Texas brings its own flavor to the tradition. East Texas soul food has more in common with Mississippi and Louisiana than with the beef-centric cooking of West Texas. But the presence of chili peppers and the influence of Mexican culinary traditions add a different dimension to the seasoning. Black cowboys, who made up roughly 1 in 4 of the cowboys driving cattle across the Western Range, also contributed to the foodways of the region. The trail cook, who fed the crew from a chuck wagon, was often a black man, and the dishes he prepared, beans, biscuits, cornbread, stewed meats, were soul food adapted for the open range. Let's talk for a moment about the cookbooks that finally captured some of this knowledge in written form, because for centuries, the recipes of soul food existed only in memory, passed down through oral tradition from generation to generation. The prohibition on enslaved people learning to read and write meant that the first black-authored cookbooks didn't appear until after emancipation, and when they did, they represented only a fraction of the culinary knowledge that existed in black communities. Abby Fisher's What Mrs. Fisher Knows About Old Southern Cooking, published in 1881, is widely considered the first cookbook by an African-American focused specifically on Southern cooking. Fisher, who was born into slavery and later became a well-known cook in San Francisco, dictated her recipes because she could not read or write. Think about that for a second. The knowledge was so deep and so refined that it could be preserved only through the voice of the cook herself, speaking her recipes into existence while someone else held the pen. The fact that literacy was denied to her and to millions like her means that we have lost immeasurably more culinary knowledge than we have preserved. In 1911, Rufus Estes published Good Things to Eat, as suggested by Rufus, another early landmark in African American food writing. Estes had been born into slavery in Tennessee and went on to become a chef for the Pullman Company, cooking in the private rail car of a steel magnate. His cookbook demonstrated the breadth of African American culinary expertise, ranging from the simple and homey to the refined and elaborate. These early cookbooks are important not just as recipe collections, but as acts of cultural preservation. Every recipe is a window into a world that was otherwise being erased by a society that preferred to forget who had actually done the cooking that built Southern food culture. They are, in a very real sense, acts of resistance, documents of expertise in a country that denied their authors the right to education and then dismissed their knowledge as unworthy of documentation. The tradition of soul food writing continued through the 20th century and into the present. Jessica B. Harris, the food historian whose work has done more than perhaps any other to document the African roots of soul food, published High on the Hog in 2011, tracing the connections between African, Caribbean, and American food traditions with meticulous scholarship and warm storytelling. Adrian Miller, whose Soul Food, The Surprising Story of an American Cuisine, won the James Beard Award in 2014, brought a combination of legal training and culinary passion to a comprehensive history of the tradition. These writers have helped ensure that the story of soul food is told by the people whose ancestors created it. Let's bring this back to the present, to the modern soul food table, to what's happening now. Soul food today is in a state of creative evolution that honors the past while looking forward. A new generation of black chefs and food writers is reimagining the tradition, not by abandoning its roots, but by reaching deeper into them. They're rediscovering the West African plant-based foundations of the cuisine, the vegetables and grains and legumes that were central to the ancestral diet before the slave trade introduced the heavy reliance on pork. They're finding that you can make collard greens that are deeply flavorful without a ham hock, that black-eyed peas don't need pork to be satisfying, that the seasoning traditions of West Africa offer a wealth of flavors that go far beyond salt and fat. At the same time, traditional soul food continues to thrive. In kitchens across America, from rural Alabama to urban Chicago, from Harlem to Houston, people are still cooking the dishes their grandmothers taught them, still measuring by feel rather than by cup, still gathering on Sundays for meals that are as much about communion as about calories. The cast iron skillet is still the most important tool in the kitchen. The pot of greens still simmers on the back burner. The sweet potato pie still comes out of the oven smelling like every holiday you've ever loved. The conversation around soul food has also expanded to include a reckoning with the cuisine's complicated relationship to health. Community health organizations, nutritionists and chefs are working together to find ways to maintain the cultural traditions while reducing the health risks. Smoked turkey instead of pork in greens, baked chicken instead of fried, olive oil where lard once ruled. These adaptations are sometimes controversial because they touch on questions of authenticity and cultural identity, but they're also necessary, and the people leading the conversation are, for the most part, doing so with deep respect for the tradition and deep concern for the community. There's a wisdom in soul food that goes beyond the recipes. It's a wisdom about making do with what you have, about finding beauty and pleasure in circumstances that were designed to deny them, about feeding people as an act of love, of resistance, of community building. about the idea that a meal shared is a bond forged, that feeding your neighbor is a form of freedom, that the kitchen is a place of power, even when the world outside that kitchen denies you every other form of power. And so tonight, as you settle deeper into your pillows and let the sounds of the evening wash over you, think for a moment about the hands that built this tradition. Think about the woman grinding corn by moonlight after a 14-hour day of forced labor. Think about the man setting a trap for rabbits in the woods behind the quarters, knowing that the protein he catches tonight will keep his children strong tomorrow. Think about the cook in the big house kitchen, performing culinary miracles for people who refuse to acknowledge her humanity, and then walking back to the quarters to cook again, this time for her own family, with the scraps and the garden vegetables, and the love that no system of oppression could take from her. Think about the grandmother who packed her cast iron skillet into a suitcase and carried it north during the Great Migration, because that skillet held the seasoning of every meal she'd ever cooked, and leaving it behind would have been like leaving behind a piece of her own soul. Think about the church women who cooked for hundreds every Sunday, turning the fellowship hall into a cathedral of flavor. Think about the restaurant owner who opened a storefront in Harlem or Bronzeville or Watts, serving plates of memory to a displaced people hungry for home. Think about the civil rights workers who met over plates of ribs and greens to plan the next march, the next sit-in, the next step toward a justice that had been denied for centuries. Think about the children who were fed by the Panthers' breakfast program, who went to school with full stomachs for the first time, because somebody decided that feeding black children was an act of revolution. And think about the food itself, the cornbread that crumbles and steams when you break it open, the greens that are dark and silky and rich with pot liquor, the fried chicken with its shattering crust and juicy interior, the mac and cheese with its golden bubbling top, the sweet potato pie that tastes like autumn and home and love all at once, the catfish that crackles in the oil, the biscuits that rise and come out of the oven looking like small clouds of perfection, the cobbler with its fruit and its crust and its brown sugar glaze. Every single one of these dishes is an act of creative genius performed under conditions of extreme duress. Everyone is a testament to the idea that the human spirit, when pressed to its absolute limits, will not simply survive, but will create something beautiful. The people who built soul food were not chefs. They were enslaved laborers, sharecroppers, domestics, factory workers, grandmothers, church cooks, and community members who were denied almost every advantage that society had to offer. They did not have culinary school educations. They did not have well-stocked pantries. They did not have professional equipment. What they had was knowledge, passed down from Africa through generations of oral tradition. What they had was creativity, born from necessity and refined by practice. What they had was love, the kind that expresses itself through feeding others, through making sure that no one in your circle goes hungry, through putting flavor and care into every single dish, even when the world gives you every reason not to bother. They proved that cuisine is not about luxury. It's about skill and soul, and the determination to make something meaningful from whatever is at hand. They proved that the most powerful cooking in the world doesn't happen in Michelin-starred restaurants. It happens in cabin kitchens and church halls and cramped apartments and backyards where the fryer is going and the neighbors are gathering, and the food is the thing that holds it all together. So tonight, as your eyes grow heavy and sleep begins to pull at you, whisper a quiet thank you to those hands. To the hands that stirred the pot and tended the garden and cleaned the chitlins and kneaded the biscuit dough and fried the chicken and baked the pie. Those hands were never famous. Most of them will never have their names spoken aloud in any history book, but their work endures, their flavors endure, their traditions endure, passed down from mother to daughter, from elder to child, from one kitchen to another, across centuries and across a nation. They cooked under the weight of chains, and they cooked in the light of freedom, and the food they made was always, always an act of defiance and an expression of love. The history of soul food isn't just about what people ate, it's about what they refused to lose, their flavors, their techniques, their connections to Africa, to family, to each other. They carried those things through the Middle Passage, through slavery, through Jim Crow, through the Great Migration, through the Civil Rights struggle, and into the present day. And they carried them the way they carried the cast iron skillet, with aching arms and absolute determination, because some things are too important to leave behind. Close your eyes now. Let the warmth of this story settle over you like a quilt stitched from 100 different kitchens. Feel the heat of the fire. Hear the crackle of the oil. Smell the cornbread and the greens, and the slow-simmered goodness of a tradition that has survived everything this country could throw at it. Rest well tonight, and know that somewhere, in a kitchen you'll never see, someone is standing over a stove, cooking with love and memory and a cast iron skillet that has been passed down through more hands than anyone can count. They're cooking for their family. They're cooking for their community. They're cooking for every generation that came before them and every generation that will come after. And the food is extraordinary, not because the ingredients are rare or expensive, but because it carries within it the entire story of a people who took the worst they were given and made from it something that feeds the soul. Sleep well, and may the memory of those hands, those kitchens, those tables overflowing with love and food follow you gently into your dreams. Good night.